The Ramsey media empire has a long and very thorny relationship with whole life insurance. They like to tell you that it's bad, and their explanation behind why it's so bad has a very loose grasp on reality, and oftentimes it's coupled with some mathematical sleight of hand. Traditionally, it looks something like cast whole life insurance in the worst possible case scenario, and then talk about stocks in the best possible case scenario. And perhaps this underscores their lack of general understanding, something they really don't want you to know they don't know that much about. On the other hand, they could just be trying to trick you. I don't really know. But at the end of the day, neither is very good. I've long argued that the argument of whole life insurance versus stocks is stupid. It's not about should you do one or the other, it's how much of one should you do and how much of the other should you do. And as a licensed life insurance agent, I will tell you that for most people, it should be a lot more stocks than it should be whole life insurance. There are a very limited number of situations where somebody might be much more heavily exposed on the risk off side of things, which is where whole life insurance sits. But the majority of Americans are going to be way better served concentrating the majority of their efforts and the majority of their net worth in something like stocks than they are whole life insurance. But there is a value to whole life insurance, and there's a value to owning it as a hedge in your portfolio against the things that don't go in your favor. But the Ramsey empire seems hell-bent on telling you that whole life insurance is the worst possible decision you could ever make. And their examples that justify their position are a bit laughable at times. And there's a video that George Kamel did not all that long ago, seeking to explain the basic differences between whole life insurance and term insurance, and playing up the role of term life insurance in the buy term and invest the difference context to explain why it's such a superior approach to taking care of your life insurance needs. Now, buy term and invest the difference is not a new subject. It's not something that I'm particularly interested in arguing about today or diving very deeply into, but the math that's used and the mistakes that are made in the attempt to justify buy term and invest the difference, it's just bananas. So we're going to take a look at it. Let's first start with the whole life scenario.
Offers an insanely low rate of return for these investments. We're talking 1 to 3% here. So let's say George gets the whole life policy investment account. Well, after 20 years of getting a 2% return rate, his investment will be worth around a measly $72,000. Womp womp. Now, after 40 years, George is now 70. Still handsome and fashionable as ever, I might add, and he has $250,000 in insurance and roughly $180,000 in cash value. Womp womp.
2% growth every single year. I don't know where that number comes from, and I can assure you there are many, many whole life policies out there that do far better than 2%, especially when we're talking 20 or 40 years out in the policy. But let's just assume it's 2%. The strange thing here is that the math is wrong. $260 per month for 20 years at 2% is $77,000, not $72,000. $72,000, that comes out to 1.34% per year. We can't even use sig figs and round up to 2 with these numbers. And if we go out to the 40-year figures, it should be $191,000, not $180,000. So why are they different? Why is there such a gap between what the number should be at 2% versus what George is telling you they are? I don't actually know. I suppose the Ramsey people would tell you fees, because whole life insurance has fees, and there are a lot, and they're expensive. But the fact of the matter is, values and rate of return, when it gets discussed with whole life insurance, is always done in net terms. So when I tell you that we have policies in force that have been in existence for 10 years, and they have a 4.75% annual rate of return, it's net of everything, all of the fees. We always talk in net terms, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. But you might be thinking that perhaps I'm just being a little nitpicky, because at the end of the day, $77,000 versus $72,000, it's not that much of a difference in terms of the money. But as we get a little further into this video and we start to look at the investment side of things, the math is going to get a lot wilder, and it becomes a lot more important to get it right. But before we do that, let's look at this little part where George tries to explain the mechanics of how death benefit works in relationship to cash value on whole life insurance, because it is woefully inaccurate.
But then George dies. But here's the worst part. The insurance company only pays out $250,000 to his family. But wait, what happened to the $180,000 of George's hard-earned savings? The insurance company keeps it. Sound like a ripoff? That's because it is. You see, only George is allowed to use the money in his investment account. So to keep it out of the insurance company's pockets, he would have had to withdraw and spend it while he was still alive. Talk about an expensive gamble.
This claim is simply untrue. People who buy whole life insurance with a focus on accumulating cash buy dividend-paying whole life insurance. And dividend-paying whole life insurance will always have an increasing death benefit when the dividend option to purchase paid-up additions is used. This is an elementary understanding of the functional mechanics of whole life insurance. And we've called the Ramsey people out on this claim before, that if you accumulate cash and you die and the cash is in the policy, the insurance company just takes your money. But this whole notion that you have to take it out, otherwise you forfeit it when you die, is a bit new, because it insinuates that you have to do this weird balancing act between leaving the money in or taking it out, and not taking out too much because then you might ruin your policy, and there's all kinds of bad things and risks that you're assuming when you buy this sort of policy that simply do not exist. And to further reinforce the truth about how whole life insurance works, here's a real whole life policy for you to look at. It's a plain vanilla whole life policy. We haven't done any sort of fancy manipulation to augment further cash performance in it. It has a $250,000 death benefit at inception. We're assuming a 30-year-old male, and it has a $270 per month premium, which I do understand is $10 more than George's example, but close enough. Notice year 40. The death benefit on the policy is $574,000. So in addition to the original $250,000 death benefit, we now have more than an additional $300,000. Also note that there's about $350,000 of cash value that has accumulated in the policy, which is substantially more than $180,000. And for those who are keeping score at home, that comes out to a 4.44% rate of return, net rate of return, by the way. So you could take the money out at some point, or you could leave it in there. And if you die at age 70, your beneficiaries will receive the original $250,000 death benefit plus a sum nearly equal to the cash that has accumulated in the policy. It doesn't sound to me like the insurance company's keeping very much. So no, you don't have to make some sort of risky gamble with whole life insurance. Perhaps this is just some sort of silly misunderstanding on George's part. But if you want to make videos and post them on YouTube that claim to explain the difference between whole life insurance and term life insurance, and you further want to make the assertion that whole life insurance is flatly inferior to term life insurance for all the reasons, this is a mistake you cannot afford to make. And this here already essentially nullifies everything George has to say on the subject. But unfortunately for him, I guess, the train wreck hasn't even reached its crescendo, because we have to talk about his projections for the investment account next.
So what if instead, George gets the $13 a month term life policy and invests the other $247 he saves each month by not choosing the whole life plan? What could that turn into? Well, let's see. If he invests that money in a good growth stock mutual fund that has an average rate of return of 11%, he would have $214,000 in investments by the time that 20-year expires. Check that out.
Sounds great. Would be even greater if it were actually true. $247 invested per month at 11% annually for 20 years is not $214,000. It comes out to a number closer to $190,000. And I'll explain all of how we get there in just a bit, but first let's take a look at this.
Let's fast forward. At 70 years old, he would have more than $2.1 million. Now we're talking. Now George has plenty of money for his family to live on without relying on life insurance.
Again, mind-blowing. A little less mind-blowing when you find out that this too is wrong. $247 invested per month at 11% annually for 40 years is not $2.1 million. It's closer to $1.7 million. We're going to dive deeply into the math, but before we do that, it should jump right out of the video to anybody who's a little bit death benefit focused that we have a problem. The term policy that George quotes at $13 a month is a 20-year level term policy. I know that because I have access to practically all the term life insurance products that are available in the United States. So I can work backwards. I can take a 30-year-old male, I can take a $250,000 death benefit, and I can see what level term policies get me closest to $13 a month, and that's 20-year level term. So after 20 years, George loses his $250,000 death benefit. He now has $190,000 of investments, accumulated, but no death benefit, which means he has less money to leave to his beneficiary by virtue of losing his term life insurance. Some of you might look at this and say, that's all right, I'm willing to take that risk. But before you do that, I'll remind you by putting the whole life ledger back up on the screen that in year 20, you have $331,000 in death benefit that has accumulated on that whole life policy, and it doesn't go away. In fact, the following year, it grows to $339,000. But still, there are people who will look at all of this and say, I think I'll still be alive at age 70. And if that's a path to millions of dollars, that's the route I want to take. And I understand your logic here, but you have to realize that you're making two very critical assumptions here. First, you're assuming that George's math is correct. And second, you're assuming that you can actually get an 11% year over year rate of return. Okay, let's talk about the math, because quite frankly, it's all over the friggin' place. When we model investments, specifically investments in the stock market, we have to take into account certain features that are idiosyncratic to stock market investments. Chief among them is the fact that returns are volatile. They're not static. We also have to account for the fact that the actual return achieved by the market requires the full year or most of the year to transpire. It is true that there's a dozen or so days on average that contribute to the overall rate of return of the market in any given year. We still don't know when those days are going to happen. They could be very early in the year, they could be very late in the year, or they could be equally distributed throughout the year. Still, we have to account for the fact that the rate of return doesn't just automatically happen at the beginning of the year. Further complicating this situation is the fact that George chose to use an example that uses monthly investments. There is a very easy way to simplify this whole situation with the calculations that we use to project future values in an investment. The easiest way to account for these monthly payments, especially when we're talking about stock market investments, is to annualize the payments and then just assume that the rate of return or interest rate will compound at the end of the year or end of the period. This is a way of controlling or taking into account the fact that not all of the dollars will be invested at the very beginning, and also not all of the rate of return will be achieved until the end of the year. But that's not what George did. Instead, George took his 11% annual rate of return assumption and he divided it by 12. He then took that quotient, 0.9167%, and he applied it to each monthly payment of $247 and assumed that it would compound at the beginning of the month. I know this is the way he did it because I did the math to replicate his results. And that approach gets me exactly his $2.1 million after 40 years, as well as his $214,000 after the first 20 years. The problem is that this will overstate expected results. We can quality control check our approach by calculating rate of return, giving the beginning and end points. So if we assume $247 invested per month for 40 years, and we arrive at $2.1 million and calculate the rate of return, it comes out to 11.33%. If, on the other hand, we take $247,000 invested per month and assume that we end up 40 years later at $1.7 million, that will get us 11%, our targeted interest rate. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking we're splitting hairs because these are fractions of percentages. I'll remind you that there is a $400,000 swing between George's answer and the right answer. $400,000 is nearly the account balance of the average 401k for a retiree in the United States. Or think of it this way. If you were expecting to take $80,000 of income against your $2 million account balance at retirement, that $400,000 represents 5 years of income that never materialized because you did the math wrong. So what are the odds of achieving an 11% rate of return over a 40-year period? First, we have to identify what we mean by rate of return because it's a relatively complicated answer to an otherwise seemingly simple question. When asked, most people will probably tell you that rate of return is the simple average. So, for a 40-year period, and the S&P 500 as an example for the stock market, we would take the annualized rate of return of the S&P 500 for 40 years, add those all up, divide it by 40, and there's your answer. And it's not technically incorrect, but it's practically useless when it comes to modeling future performance in the S&P 500. This is observational data that we can't make any inferences with because it doesn't take into account enough of the complexity of the market to actually model results. A slightly more accurate but still incorrect answer would be the compound annual growth rate. This calculates what the change in an investment is over time, and it takes into account the value of time, but it completely ignores any investments or subtractions from the investment along the way. What we actually want to know is the money-weighted rate of return. This tells us what the growth in an investment is, taking into account both time and the fact that we will be making investments or potentially subtractions from the account over that time frame. So to calculate the probability of an 11% money-weighted rate of return in the S&P 500 over a 40-year period, we need to harvest some data. And we have data, real historical data that we can use. The model that I used for my calculation used data from 1930 through 2024. And we're going to use rolling years for our observations. What this means is the first observation will be 1930 through 1969. The second observation will be 1931 through 1970. Now, there's an important point of technical clarification here. The S&P 500 as we know it today didn't exist prior to 1957. So we have to use data from a similar but not identical index, also created by Standard & Poor's, as a substitution to make this calculation. Ideally, it's not perfect, but it is a widely accepted way to create additional data that we desperately need to make appropriate inferences about market performance. Doing this kind of calculation would take a lot of time to set up the modeling in Excel or whatever sort of computational program somebody wants to use. And thankfully, we are in the modern era of AI, and it is incredibly helpful at harvesting this data and running the calculations that we ask of it. So I used both Claude and Perplexity to do this calculation for me. And I have a very highly sophisticated reason for using those two. They're the ones that I have premium access to because I subscribe to both of them. For Claude, we used the Opus model and we turned on extended thinking, which is overkill for this sort of experiment. And I certainly burned through way more Anthropic credits than I needed to, but I wanted to throw the very best Claude had to offer at the analysis. For Perplexity, we used the Labs feature and we turned on web, academic, and financial disclosures as the database to pull from. The real quality control check was how close the answer from both models were to one another. And the really good news is they were nearly identical. First, the answer. The probability of money-weighted rate of return being 11% over 40 years in the S&P 500 is a little over 50%. So it's essentially a coin flip. One of the interesting observations, though, is that none of the observations fell below 9%. Now, if you're thinking that 9% is the number you should always use to model your investments in the S&P 500, you should slow your roll. Because I reran this analysis with shorter time horizons to see what effect that had on overall results. I looked at 30 and 20-year results. The 11% money-weighted rate of return didn't change by much. It does go down, but it still remains above 50%. But the variance in the data grows considerably. The 20-year scenario drove the 100% number all the way down to 4.2%. So the shorter your investment time horizon, the more volatile your S&P 500 results are likely to be, and potentially the lower your overall expected rate of return. Now, none of this took into account month-to-month variation, so there's still a good chance that your real investment results could differ from these. And even if you have 40 years, your actual result could potentially dip slightly below 9%. But having said that, let's use 9% in our investment examples here from George. If we do $247 per month for 40 years, assuming 9% now instead of 11, our ending balance is roughly $1 million, which is still a lot of money, but it's also 1.1 million fewer dollars than George told you were going to have. Now it is considerably more than the $574,000 death benefit from the whole life policy that I showed you. And it's also very considerably more than the $350,000 of cash value that accumulated in that whole life policy. But there's still the risk that you face after 20 years where you lose your term life insurance policy. And now at 9%, your investment's only $150,000. You have to address the issue that you don't have the life insurance anymore. And one perfectly acceptable answer is, I'm just going to accept the fact that I have less money to leave to my beneficiary, and I hope I live. Some people will do it that way. but others want to hedge their bets a little bit more. By now, I hope you're realizing that this subject is more complex than George pretends, because buying life insurance is not just a singular optimization problem where you seek the path that provides the largest account balance at some random point in the future. It is instead a multifaceted consideration with more than one right answer because people vary in their preferences and their circumstances. Hedging is equally about protecting against catastrophic losses. But more importantly than all of that is the notion that modeling these things requires care and precision, because what seems like a very minor mistake can result in major consequences when it comes to actual results. I remember some years ago, Dave Ramsey himself remarked that he might get the math wrong. He might be too optimistic, but so what? It motivates people into action, which is better than what they typically are doing, nothing. To me, that's an intellectual cop-out. And it also highlights just how stupid Dave thinks you all are. Maybe it's just me, but I'm a much bigger believer in accuracy and honest assessment. I want people to know where they are, and I want them to know realistically where they might end up. And I'll acknowledge that that may not motivate everyone into action. At least it doesn't assume that you're too dumb to be trusted with the truth.